Hello everyone and welcome to the book launch of Angels of Cairo, a brand new comedy novel written by Gary Raymond and published by Parthian books. Just like to thank everyone for being here. And just before we get started, I'd like to remind you that this event is in association with Bookish, an indie bookshop in the heart of Krakow. You can purchase Gary's new novel on the Bookish website, which is linked in the description below, and I'll put the link in the chat later for you all to access if you want to. And please feel free to use the chat function throughout the event, which I believe is located on the right-hand side of your screen, or perhaps just below it for some people. But if you have any questions for Gary about the book, then these will be answered throughout. And it would be great if you could leave some comments or questions, like I said, just so we can make it as interactive as possible, considering the circumstances. But anyway, that's enough from me, and I'll now hand over to Dr. Emma Schofield, who will be in conversation with Gary Raymond about his fascinating new comedy novel, Angels of Cairo.
Thanks, Holly. Yes, so we're here for the launch of Gary's latest novel. For those of you who might not be so familiar with Gary, he is a novelist, editor, and broadcaster. He's the author of 2 previous novels, For Those Who Come After and The Golden Orphans, as well, and more recently, as a non-fiction book, How Love Actually Ruined Christmas. He's edited a wide range of fiction and non-fiction books and anthologies, and is also a critic. You might be familiar with him from his Radio Wales review show. And he is also currently studying for a PhD at Cardiff University and is the editor of Wales Arts Review. So Gary, if you'd like to join us, I think we're going to kick off this evening with a reading.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you everybody who's there. I can't see any of you. You're just out in the darkness. So I'm going to start off by reading an extract from the book Angels of Cairo. If you haven't, from my book Angels of Cairo, if you haven't read it yet, I'll give you a little bit of background. So it's the story of Robert Clifford, known as Cliff, who is being invited to the International Film Festival in Cairo to as his new film, his new feature film, has been nominated for a festival prize. So he gets there and he finds that he's been kind of lumped with having to take the nephew of his producer, Lewis Proudfoot, who is kind of like a very difficult, abrasive kind of presence for Cliff's journey. Cliff is kind of like very anxious about all of the years and blood, sweat and tears he's put into this film, and he's finding that nothing on the trip is going right. So they're at the festival site. I think that's all you need to know. Sammy is the festival director who's invited them over. Across the mezzanine, Cliff and Sammy both see the pale, stiff figure of Lewis. He's in conversation with an older, balding, bespectacled man in a shiny black leather jacket. Lewis is holding his script in his hand. Cliff hadn't even noticed Lewis had taken his bag with him. The script is open and furled from its elastic band. The page is curled at the edges, Lewis looking like a street preacher with a large print Bible. He is pointing at the pages, his small, expressionless face jutting out into that of the leather jacket man. The man, his victim, is feigning interest. Cliff recognizes the look. He's seen it plenty of times over the years, sometimes opposite his own impassioned speeches. Sammy says, let me introduce you to this man, a very dear old friend, a great man. He marches Cliff across the mezzanine. The man calls out Sammy's name as they get closer and throws his arms in the air. Sammy, this is your friend from the UK. I am loving his crazy script idea. He has a big smile like an animated shark. Sammy corrects the man. No, this is my guest, and this is Lewis, the guest of my guest and representative of the producer of my guest's film. Cliff doesn't like any of those descriptors. Robert, this is my old friend Mahmoud, and he just happens to be the finest film critic in all the Arab nations. Both Egyptian men laugh loudly at this, but Mahmoud does not contradict his friend. Mahmoud leans in and shakes Cliff's hand. The body language of Mahmoud is warm, welcoming, enthusiastic, but his words remain focused on Lewis's script. Magic and monsters, but it also has real heart, he says. Has he told you about this, Sammy? You should think about buying it. Mahmoud looks Cliff in the eye. Are you his agent? He says. No, Mahmoud, Sammy says. I just told you he is the director of the UK entry for the debut prize. Mahmoud looks for a second at both the British men with slight confusion. Cliff wants to correct Lewis's role in all this, but he doesn't want to call him a representative of the producer. After all, Cliff was one of the producers as well as the writer and the director. Preston was just one of many financiers, but he also doesn't want to contradict Sammy. Lewis is my travel companion, Cliff says, and it cuts through the hubbub and every single person in that entire auditorium, thousands upon thousands of them. Some of them have climbed the awnings to get a vantage. They seem to stop and turn to look at him. Mahmoud looks at Sammy and then Lewis and then back at Cliff. Are they about to laugh? Could Cliff have made it sound any weirder? Travel companion. Like, where is Sammy going with this? He has a cheeky smile on his face and puts his chin into his hand thoughtfully. Like Joan Fontaine in Rebecca. Sammy chuckles his own joke and Mahmoud joins in. These guys know their Western cinema. So you're a filmmaker, Mahmoud says with great mercy. Which one is yours? Cliff clears his throat and shuffles on the spot. He says, it's called Last January, but he's left off the important indefinite article and he has to repeat it. The Last January, and he repeats it again as if doing so erases the first mistake and starts anew. The Last January. Mahmoud seems to be trying to locate this title in his memory banks, and eventually he says, as if to the air rather than to Cliff, I don't like the title very much. It's not very memorable. It speaks of the central theme of the movie, Cliff says, or wants to say. Finality, beginnings, January, looking both forwards and backwards. But Mahmoud goes on. But a title must be memorable, he says. How do you say, oh, darling, shall we go to the cinema this evening to see, what's it called? Something to do with January or something? It's about January, is it? What's it about? Maybe it's about being depressed after New Year's Eve parties. I lived in England for a while. That is a thing, right? You all get very sad in January. No, nobody wants to go and see a film about January, the title of which they can't even remember in the first place. Maybe, darling, we should go and see Iron Man. You know, it is a film about a man in an iron suit. You need a good title. Cliff stares at Mahmoud. Who talks that way about going to the cinema, he says, or he thinks he says. Nobody talks that way. He looks to Sammy and then to Lewis for some backup, but he gets neutrality. What has Iron Man got to do with anything? Mahmoud laughs and it develops into a mild coughing fit. Sammy begins to slap him across the back and he casts Cliff a glance as if he were the cause of it. Relax, Sammy says. Mahmoud is just pulling your leg. Mahmoud rounds off his coughing and straightens himself up. When is your film showing, he says. I haven't seen the schedule yet. The judges are always the last to know. Mahmoud grabs Sammy by the shoulder and rocks him, laughing, grizzled through his teeth. It is on tonight, Sammy says, before Cliff can answer. You have the schedule, old man. You just haven't taken it out of your pocket yet. They're ribbing each other, which is nice to see, but Cliff would like to get something straight before the frivolity begins, like if his film can even be shown tonight. First showing, Mahmoud says, and he rolls his bottom lip and nods his head approvingly. Last never wins, he says. Everyone is tired, full of food and late nights. Most judges snooze through the last film of the competition. This is a good sign. Could do with a few of those. Mahmoud straightens and Sammy leads him off a few yards away. Excusing himself for a second, Cliff watches, slightly dazed, slightly bemused, as the two men chat closely in some kind of conspiratorial union. Then he feels eyes on him. Lewis. Lewis is standing next to him with that blinkless gaze fixed on Cliff's head. It's coming. He can feel it, like projectile vomit. It's coming. And then it comes. A recreation of Lewis's conversation with Mahmoud, only Lewis can't remember Mahmoud's name and he taps his forehead trying to recollect it. Lewis opts for that critic man over there, and then he goes on to quote seemingly verbatim all the positive things that critic man over there said about his script. That critic man over there understands the visual dynamics of it. That critic man over there understands the emotional undercurrent. He wants to know more. He wants to hear more. wants to understand the vision better because Lewis wants to direct this script himself. And although he's resisted the temptation until now, the time he spent in Cairo with these people has proved to him he has the vision to take the helm himself. And now he will have to insist on it as being not only the right thing to do, but to some extent there is a moral imperative to it. And of course he would direct it himself. Of course he would. Of course. And now Lewis is explaining the visual dimensions to Cliff and how the sand will burn like mustard and will part like waves for the tentacular sea creatures. But he also wants the textures of pen and ink, like one of his manga artist heroes, the names of which Cliff can never really pick out whenever Lewis gets into his stream of consciousness monologue and the genre, and the texture will be rich and subtle and informed by a deep emotional understanding of Japanese culture. And my God, he's going to go on about Japanese culture now. And we seem to have left his script behind for a moment in favor of some cultural critique of Japan, and then to Lewis and how he cannot really pinpoint where his admiration for Japanese culture comes from. And he runs through a bullet point list of the things he admires about Japanese culture, and Cliff feels himself looking Lewis up and down, and he's evaluating his physicality. Is he about to attack Lewis? It wouldn't take much to flip him over the balcony and off the mezzanine, tumbling into the crowds and the concrete below. Not much at all. I should have said that Mahmood is the judge for the feature film prize. Sammy is back. Cliff snaps out of it, rubs the back of his neck with the moist palm of his hand. Lewis is still and silent. Is he? Cliff says. Not a good sign if he can't remember the name of my film. Cliff laughs nervously. Sammy imitates Cliff's laugh, note for note. Don't worry, Sammy says. He was pulling your leg about the title. The final January is very memorable. The last January, Cliff snaps. The last January. Thank you. That's weird doing that because I'm just in a room on my own acting that out.
To yourself. Is that not what you do? Just
it's
read
normal for me. That's totally normal.
From your book to yourself. Thanks, Gary. Shall we start by talking a bit about how the novel came about? We've shifted from the Cypriot setting of your last novel, The Golden Orphans, to Egypt here. So what drew you to Cairo as a setting?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer is I was there. I was in Cairo just before lockdown, just before the pandemic, really, quite a while before lockdown, I suppose, in January of 2020. And I was over there because I'd been invited by the International Book Fair because my previous book had been translated into Arabic. So I was invited out there. So really... It's one of those things, rather like my previous book, you know, the based in Cyprus. It was one of those things where things sort of come together, kind of when you least expect it, really. So you have this confluence of theme and character, and then some things you're thinking about, and some characters you're thinking of, you know, you'd like to put into a story, and then you kind of. So all these things come together, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a place where you can see the story sort of makes itself known. So as with, you know, The Golden Orphans, I wanted to write about certain themes, and then eventually when Cyprus kind of made itself known, it fitted. So there was a book there then all of a sudden. And the same sort of thing happened with Angels of Cairo, really. I was flying back and I was writing up my notes, the sort of notes I'd made while I was like sat in the back of taxis and whatever, and I was sort of writing them up and expanding them and the thoughts on them, and then it became obvious that this idea of this book that I'd had in the back of my mind for a while, writing about you know, what it is to be somebody who sacrifices or thinks they're sacrificing everything for their own kind of their own creative work, and how that becomes the center of your life and nothing else really matters, and you kind of center that thing, and to sort of explore that idea, that Cairo seemed the best place. I mean, a lot of the things that happen in the book are based upon, you know, things that I experienced when I was there. I mean, I had a wonderful time and everybody was wonderful, and so it's not like, you know, it was full of really annoying people or anything. That certainly wasn't the case. But things like you know, there's a scene in where Cliff has a little bit of trouble with an interviewer. But whereas the interview was, did several interviews when I was over there, whereas they were all really great and the interviews were really generous, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be good if the interviewer just like didn't just like actually didn't like him, just felt he was quite arrogant and rude, and he cannot understand how anybody could think that of him. And of course, he is arrogant and rude. That's exactly who he is. I was, sort of impromptu tour of Tahrir Square and shown where a lot of the things that happened with the Arab Spring and the uprising, that found its way into the book as well. And the CNN footage of the helicopter going over the bridge and all that kind of all came from real things that happened. So yeah, Cairo was, also to an extent, you do have this thing where you go to this, any writer will tell you the sort of impetus of this sort of thing, but you go to a place like Cairo and you don't want it to just be some kind of bubbled, half-dreamt experience of years ago. You think, well, this is an amazing place and an amazing experience. Let's try and just sort of trap it somewhere, in document it in my life, that I had that experience and went and did that. But it's certainly, as you kind of write the book, then as you kind of develop drafts, these themes come through that, attach to your original idea, and it you're kind of talking about there, how a book sort of becomes a book from an idea, really. But I really loved Cairo, and I was coming back on the plane and writing up the notes, and I didn't think it would ever be a book. I never thought that. I just thought I'd sort of written a notebook full of ideas and things that I could probably look back on when I'm old and infirm and go, oh yes, I had that 3 or 4 days in Cairo once. That was a great experience. But what happened was that lockdown happened, and I thought, well, I'm going to type up these notes and see what I've got. And I sent them to Richard Davis at Parthian because I thought it was funny, and it was a world that he and I both know, in that even though I transposed the experience in the novel as a filmmaker at a film festival, that was just to create a little bit of distance so I could write a little clearly about it, rather. And I've always had this idea that nobody or very few people want to read about a writer writing about a writer, but people are quite interested in writers sort of stepping outside of themselves like that. So there was the distance, but also there was the element of, this is they're quite sort of boilerplate, really. These types of places in these, it's just the festival's just outside the city. You could be anywhere, luckily I was invited over there, and had, wonderful hosts, really good, nice, energetic, enthusiastic, warm people who loved their city and wanted to talk to me about it and show me around it and things like that. So I got to see other things, but otherwise I would have just seen an airport, a hotel, and the inside of a massive aircraft hangar conference center. But I sent it to Rich. I thought I thought it was quite funny, and he thought it was funny enough to tell me to double it in length, develop it, and turn it into a novel. So that's what happened. That's why Cairo, because I was there.
Why not? You mentioned there that idea of the confluence between place and character and plot, and that was something that surprised me when I first read this, is the change of tone from your previous work. So you've moved to a humorous tone here, and I wondered what drew you to write a comic novel this time, because the tone is light throughout, and yet grief is actually something that's very present thematically in the novel as well. So I kind of wondered how you'd decided to take that approach.
Yeah, well, I suppose that the theme of grief is something that comes quite late, but there are no jokes about grief in the book, and I think as well, to an extent, like a good book, particularly a comedy, it needs to have some kind of heart to it, and I think the heart there is the lost connections of Cliff, but certainly between his parents. I was looking at extracts to read, and I thought it would be best to read a sort of fast, funny extract. But I almost chose to read the piece in that interview where he's giving the interview to the woman journalist, and he starts sort of talking to himself, really, and sort of talking about, for the first time, really opening up about his relationship with his mother and with his father, and I think that's where the heart of the book is. But on the sort of flip side of that is that that stuff, the idea of the film really being about his mother, although he keeps denying it's about his mother, was because I thought there was a good gag. I thought if he, as I was developing the, sort of the second draft from the stuff I wrote on the plane, I thought, well, the comedy is very much, it's I mean, this isn't a great selling point, it doesn't sound like one, but the comedy is very much like a one-dimensional thing. It's and I see it in my mind, it's kind of that very sort of British, even sort of English comedy tradition of the put upon man in the center of things, who just like cannot catch a break, so like Tony Hancock or Basil Fawlty, or that's the comedy world. It's quite simple. There's nothing too revolutionary or complicated about where I found the comedy in the book. And then it was just about finding things to pile on top of him to drive him to a point where he has this kind of self-revelatory experience where he realizes he's been an ass all his life. So it was just about finding things to pile on top of him. And one of the things is that he keeps meeting people who say, oh, I saw your film, it's so beautiful to make a film about your mother. And he's like, it's not about my mother, but of course it is about his mother. So one of the things lying in there is, that there is the element of grief attached to his mother who has passed away, but also to his father, who is at the very end stages of his life and who he's worried might die while he's in Cairo. He's kind of at that stage. So all of that stuff kind of filters out from the central idea of what you need to sustain the joke, which is how much crap can you pile on top of this protagonist. So yeah, again, sort of another bit of insight into how the novel develops out of a small little kernel of an idea into something bigger and wider, I suppose.
You're talking there about the comedy being, quite straightforward and nothing radical, but actually the style and structure of the novel is completely different from the style you've used before. This is quite pacey. There's no chapters. We've got no natural breaks in it. And it almost felt to me when I was reading it as if I was reading the narrative version of a series of scripts or something from scenes of a film. I found that once I'd started reading it, it kind of kept on flowing. I couldn't actually find a place to put it down anyway, so I just kind of kept going. I didn't really want to. I was enjoying it. But it does have that effect on you that you're watching it unfold as if you're watching a film. And I wondered what kind of, was that the effect you were hoping to elicit with that structure, or?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was really. I mean, to me, I mean, it's very difficult for me to understand whether it works or not. But people who have read it or anybody who's commented to me has commented on how funny they find the book. So to me, the structure is part of the comedy. I mean, there's more white space in this book than my previous books, and that's on purpose. Essentially that's timing. I'm kind of forcing the jokes into the place I want them to happen in your head in the reading experience, as if you were listening to me do some stand-up or do a reading I don't do stand-up, but like a sort of stand-up experience. So the white space is timing, or it's supposed to be, and it breaks up in places where you just need to take a pause, and then you'll get the punchline. But also something that did happen and did develop, and a few people have commented on how it does begin to. Not some people said it looks like a script, but it doesn't. I think what people mean is like what you were saying, Emma, is that it sort of recreates a kind of filmic experience. So you have sort of fade in and fade out kind of things where there's a little bit more white space, or you need to turn a page or whatever. And that's all done on purpose. And working with my editor, and working with oh, my mind went blank then. The person who puts it all over the page. Who puts it actually in? I can't remember what that's called now. That's terrible, isn't it? So the typesetter. I knew that would come to me. I was just hoping that we would still have time to answer other questions before it did. So the typeset, I'm working, making sure that those things went from my dusty old Word document into the typesetting, because all of that spacing was quite important to the timing. Yeah, so
I think that came across really, because I think there's times where you've got those spaces, particularly sometimes before Lewis starts talking, where it's that comic timing of, you know, it's coming, we know what's coming, Cliff knows what's coming, and you're waiting for it. And I think, you know, that really worked. Should we talk a bit about Cliff, because he's the lead character and he's quite a complex figure. You've already said he's determined to the point of being a bit obsessed with this film and this opportunity he has to present it now at the festival. But he also seems quite frustrated with the direction his life has taken and how he's ended up here. So he seems to be a bit lost in spite of everything we know he's already achieved in his career. I mean, do you think that's a fair assessment of his character?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's. I mean, it's important to emphasize that, like, Cliff isn't me, but I am exploring things that I've thought about a lot over the years with his character. So you know, he's like the completely crippled with self-doubt and lack of achievement version of me. You know, so you know, if I had his mentality and thought about these things, I would, you know, then perhaps we would be closer together. But and I could have been, you know, I suppose I if things had gone differently, I could have been. But you do always think about, you know, when, I don't know, like you know, you've got a book out and everything's going really well, it's really successful, people are enjoying it, people are buying it, and then you notice that it hasn't been nominated for any prizes, and you notice there's one newspaper that hasn't reviewed it, and you're thinking, well, so and so over there was reviewed in that paper, why wasn't I reviewed in that paper? It's because I'm actually not really achieving the things that I think I'm achieving. So it's about all that self-doubt and that, like, imposter syndrome and all that stuff, but it's also about, which I think is a particularly, like, male imperative, this idea that there is an element of entitlement to any sort of, you know, man who has creative impulse, or you know, you really like the films of Martin Scorsese, so you must go to film school and you must create, like, gangster movies. How many men have we all met like that? I sounded I should have opened a bottle of wine as I said that, shouldn't I? How many men have we all met who are like that? But I think, like, you know, looking back in my 20s and probably a bit older, that I've been kind of that person as well. I mean, you know, I'm not now, I don't think that way, you know, but I wanted to explore those things with Cliff, and I think he's the thing that not worries me, but the thing that's interested me is the number of people who got in touch and say that they, you know, for all his flaws, they really liked him. And I find that you can kind of be on his side by the end of the book, because he comes to a realization that he's been behaving, you know, behaving incorrectly for all of his life, to friends and family. This idea that the drive of his life is just, you know, this creative work, and it's the most important thing in the world, and as long as he gets that, and of course then there's that thing of every time, you know, he's made films before, this is his first, like, fictional feature film, he's made documentaries, but that idea that every time you make something or put something out, it doesn't fulfill it doesn't fill that hole or something, you know, that you have inside, this kind of entitlement to being admired and loved and all that kind of stuff. And I think, like, I suppose I was thinking a little bit about, like, when my first book came out, and I'd wanted to be a novelist, like, all my life, and my first book came out, and I never enjoyed it. I didn't take the time to enjoy it. I was immediately like, right, what comes next? All my life I'd wanted to see a book on it with my name on it in a shop. And the moment it was out, I was just thinking, right, well, really, I need minimum 3 books out. Otherwise, how can I even call myself a writer? And then, you know, you get 3 books out and you're like, well, really, I should really be, you know, here, and I should be doing this. And there's never any fulfillment. And I definitely, I mean, after, you know, I really enjoyed The Golden Orphans being successful, and I made sure I did, because you know, there's not much point otherwise, is there? You can say all this stuff about, well, the important thing is the work. if you're getting something out of the work, all that matters is the work. But I think, that is important. But enjoying. I suppose you owe it to all those people that don't get as lucky as you do to really enjoy it. Really, I suppose. I don't know. But that's Cliff is complex. That's why I just made a complete rat's ass of trying to explain him.
I get it. I think it's like you said, even if you start out thinking he's a bit annoying, I think by the end we can relate to it. We're probably all a little bit Cliff at times. And I think, there's that element all the time for us of sort of what's next, what should we be moving on to that people can recognize. We've got a question from Cara, which is a really good question here. So we've talked a bit about, how we can relate to Cliff. At the other end of the scale, we have Lewis. Cara's asking what makes him so good at annoying Cliff, and was he fun to write? I mean, dare we ask if he's based on anyone? Are we allowed to ask that?
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, you can ask. I mean, he's based on. We've all kind of met these people, haven't we? In my mind, Lewis comes out of the book really well, but I'm not sure if that's coming across from the feedback of. I think Lewis is the individual. Lewis is the person who is going about his life in the way that he sees fit. He's not really. The trouble with Cliff is he's always like he always wants something from people, whereas Lewis isn't. I mean, I know Lewis wants to get his film made, but Lewis is just like out there doing his thing, and I think by the end, the whole point of Lewis really is to see. I mean, without getting like boringly technical, but if you think of Lewis's like narrative arc as being no arc at all, Lewis just keeps on a straight line all the way through. He's completely immovable. But the thing that I think makes him interesting and a full character is that he's there to shine a light on Cliff's journey. So Cliff's arc is just we call it's an arc shape. That's why I've decided to call it an arc. I've just coined that term. Nobody's ever used that before. So that you kind of it reflects on him, and the fact that he comes to a place which is a little more admirable and noble towards the end, I think is sort of bounces off Lewis. I mean, he is annoying, but of course he's supposed to be annoying, because I think he'd be annoying to anybody, but he's particularly annoying to Cliff, because for Cliff to have his journey as a character, he needs somebody to be bouncing against. And all the characters in the book really are there to sort of draw out Cliff's anxieties. But Lewis, I think, is obviously Lewis is, what you might call the inciting incident. So, Cliff is very much on edge and, before he gets to Cairo. But as he reflects in the book, like meeting Lewis is the thing that pushes him over the edge, really. And just that flight, just the time in the airport and the flight and breakfast opposite him is the thing that pushes him over the edge. Was he fun to write? I mean, yeah, he was fun to write, because, Carly Holmes, my brilliant editor, who was just wonderful on this, was just great at just going, right, you cut all this, because there's so much of Lewis on the cutting room floor, because I just wrote streams and there was like 10-page speeches, and there was of just streams of just and Carly was just kind of, look, we kind of get it, but people are going to skip ahead because this guy will drive you insane. So there's lots, there's an outtake reel. If this was a movie of Lewis, I don't know, that's a bit too meta. But yeah, he was fun to write. But I suppose to an extent, there's something in a technical way, something villainous about him. He sort of fulfills that role, and villains are always fun to write.
He's fun to read as well. I mean, you mentioned that where we first meet him in the airport, he's annoying at that point, but I do think you kind of start to feel a little bit sorry for him as it goes along as well, because you can almost feel Cliff tensing up and rolling his eyes every time Lewis goes to speak. And I think, there's a bit more depth to him than maybe it first seems when we see him at the airport, and we just think this guy is incredibly irritating. How could you put up with him for a whole trip? There's more there.
Well, yeah, exactly, and that was really important to me. Like I worked on his character a lot and the relationship between him and Cliff, because Lewis had to be a sympathetic character, otherwise it was not going to reflect well on Cliff. It's not supposed to reflect well on him for most of the book, but by the end of it, when he kind of comes around and appreciates Lewis for just being who he is, I think that's kind of the thing, is that Lewis is just who he is, whereas Cliff is constantly trying to aspire to something rather than just being himself, I suppose. Yeah.
Another good question here. You mentioned a few TV personalities earlier on, Hancock, Basil Fawlty. Are there any particular literary influences too that led you into comic writing, or this novel in particular? Anything you want to pick up on there?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I was thinking about it largely in like cinematic terms, really, in filmic terms, and that's where the kind of humor. But there are some really funny writers who kind of, whenever you're writing anything, there's always writers who are kind of looking over your shoulder a little bit. And I think like the funniest book I've ever read is, I mean, by a long distance as well, like laugh out loud, by far the funniest book I've ever read is Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. And I remember just reading it like in my late teens or something, and having to stop at the bottom of the first page and thinking, I've never laughed like this at a book before. And it's all about the style. And I think attaching the prose to the kind of the psychosis of Cliff is what creates the style. Jerome is a little different because he's quite removed from the three characters, but he likes to dip in and out of the from the point of view of different characters, and even the dog, if Montmorency, if I remember rightly. But also, I mean, yeah, there are loads of funny writers. Often not so much novelists, but in my life, I've found myself reading writers that I didn't think I would be that interested in, just because they were funny. Like Bill Bryson, or there are loads of really good funny writers around at the moment as well. Like Marina Hyde, obviously, is excellent on just like. That idea of getting to the absolute center of somebody's personality just by creating one line. Saul Bellow always had this idea that characters essentially can always be boiled down to their essence. They can be boiled down to one sentence. He's got a character in the novella, The Bellarosa Connection, this old Jewish woman who he describes as like being sunk in the middle like a car jack, and that image of her, no matter what she does or says for the rest of that book, follows her around. And I think satirists that's their art, that finding that one thing that attaches to a character. Lots of funny writers, and not all novelists. Anyone who writes funny stuff, I think, has found their way into this book, really, that I've read.
It's interesting there, from your examples. I was just thinking about Jerome's book as well. It's the timing again, isn't it? I mean, we're coming back to what you said earlier about leaving those spaces so that those details of their character can actually come through, and that is where the comedy lies, really. It's an art form in itself.
Well, yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be, I suppose. Yes, I agree. It is an art form, and it takes a real writer of top quality to pull it off, I'd say.
There we are. Obviously. Not going to argue. I guess thinking about the characters we've talked about so far, we've obviously talked about Lewis and Cliff. At first glance, I suppose you could say that this is quite a male-focused novel. The majority of the main characters in the novel are men, and yet the female characters who are included are actually quite central to the plot and to understanding how these male characters see themselves. I'm thinking of Marie, Cliff's long-suffering partner, characters like Francesca and Deb, who pop up at the festival and have quite key roles. So I guess they seem quite important to me as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is a male male-centered novel. It is because it's about, you know, as I was saying before, it's about this kind of psychological place that I've never really encountered in a woman. You know, and you see it in men all the time. This entitlement to grand achievement, this like obsessive need for admiration, and this kind of drive to individual recognition. Yeah, you know, I mean, maybe women are just extremely good at covering that up or something. I don't know, but I've never. But so it is a male-centered book, and I don't think that that there's anything wrong with that, even in this day and age, where I totally understand, you know, people who are like, well, haven't we had hundreds of years of male-centered books? Can't we do some other stuff now? And yeah, of course, yeah, that's fine. But I'm gonna, you know, write what I write, and that was the thing that I wanted to discuss and get into. I think that all the characters in the book are there to reflect something back onto Cliff, who is, you know, as well as other things, is an embodiment of this question of entitlement and ambition and aspiration. I mean, you have to work within the parameters you set yourself in a fictional world, don't you? So, you know, a review of the book recently kind of said that, you know, when I put the written women in Angels of Cairo, I'd only really concentrated on like their looks, which, okay, if you're going to sling that at like Norman Mailer or something, but it's a misreading of the book, because the reason, you know, I took a long time making sure that I was writing the women in the way that reflected the character of Cliff. So if the women are only being described by the way they look, it's because that's how men look at women. That's it. When you know, that's how most men, you know, when you meet a woman or meet anybody really, you first of all think of the way they look, right? I mean, we can all be in a different place, being sort of educated out of that, you know, that lack of sensitivity. But it was important to me that Cliff was that type of person, that I wasn't trying to create this, like, you know, new man who was, you know, all of these things. You know, Cliff wouldn't have time for understanding any of the nuances of feminism, for instance, because he's been too busy with his film. He wouldn't understand any, you know, any really like developments in social politics or any of those sorts of things, because he's been busy with his film, right? He only understands the character of Howard in the book. He only understands, you know, Trump politics, because Howard is this sort of rival filmmaker who turns up wearing a Make America Great Again hat. He only understands Trump politics because he knows it's a stick to beat his rival with. So he knows Trump bad. So Howard's a Trump supporter. So obviously that's all terrible together. We know, but he hasn't got the focus to go any further than that. So I think that the writing of the women in the book, I think the way they behave and the way that they interact, you know, the way that I show them is as you know, close to as full of characters as I can. But the way that they're described is the way that Cliff would think of them.
I just wanted to draw in there a comment I've just noticed from Carly, that what gives Cliff heart and conscience is Marie, is his girlfriend, and the fact that their exchanges are fun, they're affectionate, but also she doesn't let him off the hook. And actually she does hold him to account as well there. Whether Cliff is grateful for that at all times, I'm not sure, but he definitely seems to need her as a character to kind of keep pulling him back and reminding him what's important. She does anchor him, doesn't she? Yeah,
she does. And I think that, an important aspect of the book is that he's completely, you know, they say she anchors him. He's completely rudderless because she's not with him in Cairo. Like, she's not there to tug him on the sleeve and say, "Don't be a dick." You know, but he keeps thinking about, you know, oh, she, you know, I know exactly what Marie would be saying to me right now, and she'd be right, but I can't help myself. I'm just this person. And I think, like, you know, clearly, possibly with the exception of Sammy, who's the sort of festival director, I think, you know, clearly the strongest characters, the strongest people in the book are all the women. You know, I don't know if that, you know, the person who sort of mentioned this in the review had really understood the book, really, to be honest, because you've got this moment where Cliff meets these three women who work for the film company, work for the festival, and he describes what they look like. You know, they've got nice smiles and they got like round faces and they seem, you know, really warm and all this. And that's how he describes them. But then in the conversation, he finds out that they're all like, you know, one's got a PhD and one is making a documentary about Iranian female filmmakers of the 1970s. You know, these are brilliant, like accomplished women that he is completely like misjudged because they, are pretty and nice to him. So I hope, but you know what you're going to do, critics, eh? Useless.
No comment. So I mean, keeping that idea of misconceptions and I guess not judging people by how they first seem on first glance, first impression. I was interested that we had the theme of age as well running through is a sort of background in the novel, because Cliff seemed very conscious of his own age and the fact that he felt like this was a kind of last roll of the dice for him career-wise. And at one point we hear Sammy talking about how the world now belongs to the young and that the young people are the ones who can take things forward politically. And we've also got this really fascinating scene where Sammy takes Cliff and Lewis to meet a group of young radicals in Cairo. And it becomes very clear that they actually owe some kind of debt to Sammy. We never find out exactly what happened, but that he did something or other that saved them somehow from going to jail. And I wondered if you thought that age really matters when it comes to things like politics and art, or is that just Cliff and Sammy musing?
I think it's quite important. In one of the themes in the book is of, passing, as you say, age and passing time, and that was something that came through from being in Cairo and understanding, having some conversations with people at the festival. This is like a casual conversations over coffee or whatever. This isn't like, this isn't like set up stuff, but just asking questions about the city and about the Arab Spring and how like really proud people there are that happened, and just like almost like moving into the young ultras who are involved, kind of like moving into like folkloric position within people who still would like to see Egypt the country that they believe it could be. And of course without getting into the politics, the whole Arab Spring thing has been unpicked, and it's not the country that they were fighting for. I'm not an expert, so I don't want to get muddled in this stuff, but the idea that facilitate that the future belongs to the young, that facilitating, and of course the joke in that is that like Cliff is like 38, so he's just being a bit of a dick, because he's got his whole long life ahead of him, and he can still achieve things and still do things, but he's panicking because he's looking 40, down the barrel of the gun of 40, and he's convinced that if this isn't a success, to an extent there's an element in there that he's been told and has been convinced that if this film doesn't win a prize, then he's not going to get anything else funded ever, or rather winning a prize will guarantee funding. But yeah, I think like in general, it's the age old thing, really age old, that the young, or youth is wasted on the young or whatever. But as I'm now in my 40s, and I kind of think of, when I was young, I used to say to people that, writing is a long game, and you're going to get to the point when you're 70 and you get really good, and then you realize just how much left there is to learn. But I think of writers like, Jose Saramago, who didn't write a novel till he was retired and won the Nobel Prize, that kind of thing. So I think, slightly different point, but I think the publishing industry is currently obsessed with youth and debuts and new writers and emerging and all that kind of stuff. And I there's not knocking any of the writers, but I worry sometimes that with all of this focus and initiative in developing young writers and giving these opportunities, that you don't give writers the opportunity to, scrap around on the floor and confront their own demons, and because they're constantly being invited to writing retreats and all this kind of shit, rather than battling whatever it is, like dead end jobs or drinking too much or whatever those demons are. I think the focus always should be on who's saying the most interesting thing, and that can be a 20-year-old, but more often than not it's older people, and I think that's kind of reflected in the book, isn't it? Because you have that thing of you have that kind of worry that Sammy is sort of overreaching and is trying to get involved in something that's young, but then you realize that actually he's probably the most useful person in that entire environment.
Yeah, I guess the contrast was there as well, wasn't it? Because as you've said, you've kind of drawn on things that I'm not going to get into the discussion over age in the art world. We've you've heard me ranting about that before. We've had that conversation, but it's that kind of conveyor belt sense of pressure and moving to the next thing and time running out all the time, and we see that a little bit with that radical group as well, that they kind of feel a different sense of pressure to Cliff, but again, some pressure that they have to do something before time runs out. But then at the other end of the political spectrum, you've included Howard, who is a very firmly committed Donald Trump supporter. He wears his Make America Great Again hat with much pride. And I wondered why you thought, to draw him in as well, how that came about.
Well, I wanted to sort of amp up the anxiety level for Cliff, really. So the thought of bringing Howard into the festival, who's like an old rival, that's where the idea of bringing him in, because he comes in quite late in the book, giving him that affiliation with Donald Trump is again just a further, like an extension of the exploration of this idea of entitlement and things slipping away, not achieving what you think you're going to achieve. And there's a little passage that sort of gives a little bit of background about Howard and how, he started out making these clearly deeply misogynistic indie movies that were, being sort of lauded. He was probably a kind of proto Tarantino, and I mean, I don't know anybody in the history of creativity who quite clearly hates women as much as Quentin Tarantino. I mean, it's just staggering that anybody watches his film. I mean, I watch them, but just to see if he's likes women this time, I don't know. But the entire history of Tarantino movies is just him beating the shit out of women for ages on screen. And I think that's kind of, was Howard's thing, and people got sick of it. It hasn't happened with Tarantino, obviously, but America has he's an American, and America's kind of moved to a sort of liberal place before Trump, and because he just needs to have this career, he moves into areas where people are going to worship him. So he he moves further and further to the right until he's making crackpot documentaries about Ku Klux Klan rap groups and things like that. So that was a bit of fun. It doesn't sound like Ku Klux Klan rap group. It's just a bit of fun. But that was me being extreme and ridiculous and having a bit of fun with the idea and seeing how far I could push, because I think that's where extremist politics comes from, certainly from men. A lot of the time, not all the time. Some people just, have, I don't know, serious issues and mental health problems or whatever. But a lot of people go in that direction because they find a home. They find a place where people are going to treat them as if they're important. We can go off and talk about Trump and Brexit and all these things, but people just feeling quite rightly feeling like they've been left behind and just wanting to be recognized and admired and to be singled out as something, as having achieved something. So as Howard is sort of being ignored, 10, 15 years before the book starts, he gets to this place where he turns up in the book and he's a full-on MAGA cap wearing. But of course, I mean, I don't want to like alter anybody's reading of the book if you haven't read it yet. But of course, he's also a bit of a ghost, because one figure that hangs over the book is H.P. Lovecraft, who, of course, whose name was Howard Philip Lovecraft. So he's kind of so the Howard Phillips character in the book is also a bit of a ghost. He's sort of a little bit of a ghost at the feast. Yeah, is that an answer, or did I mention Brexit and everything went blank? Did everyone?
No, we haven't mentioned.
Can everyone
Brexit
still
so far.
see? I think I said the word. I said the word Brexit and I just passed out.
No. Yeah.
Sorry.
We've got a question from Kieran, which I'm going to come back to in a second, but I just want to ask you about the end of the book before we get to that. If you have got any questions as well, do pop them in the comments, because we are keeping an eye on that as well. This is difficult because I don't want to give too much away about the ending of the novel. This feels like one of these questions that's pointless, because I'm going to say don't spoil the ending and then ask you about the ending. But without ruining it for everybody, I was fascinated by the fact that you present the reader with two different scenarios for Cliff as we're starting to reach the climax of the novel, and why you decided to do that, to throw it open to readers to say, well, there's these two scenarios.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is difficult to talk about it without. Well, firstly, I had two endings, right? I thought of there are two very satisfying places for the reader where this book can draw up. So I wrote them both, and then you can, and then you've just to see sort of how they worked on the page. And the one ending that I thought the readers deserved, I didn't think was the ending I wanted. So I've given the readers an ending that I think the readers deserve, and then I've given another ending which is the correct end. This isn't like alternate universes. This is just like essentially two different conclusions to the book. But also I wanted, because the book is about film and it's cinematic, there's loads of references to film all the way through different elements. I wanted there to be, I didn't want to have a cinematic ending as in like the camera pans up, or cinematic ending like there's a big gun battle or something. But so I wanted some kind of like, I was thinking of like ironic endings in cinema, and I was thinking, even though it's a little bit different, but I was thinking of things like Blazing Saddles and the whole Monty Python's Holy Grail, where you have those sort of ironic, self-referential meta endings. And I was thinking about those things. That's not what I've done, but I was thinking about films that ended that sort of just make you bring attention to the artifice, that kind of thing. So I mean, really, it was just like I put the two endings on there, and then I sent it back off to Parthian. It's like the new draft, whatever draft that was, draft 3 or 4 or something. And I completely, absolutely expecting notes back saying, well, you're going to have to pick one of these endings. But no, I mean, Carly's here. Perhaps she's now thinking, oh, I totally meant to say, oh, did we go with the version with two endings? But yeah, and then, like after the book was to bed, really, because I wrote this last year, and then like at the end of the summer, I wrote How Love Actually Ruined Christmas. So this book was like to bed for quite a few months. And then I watched I May Destroy You, the Michaela Cole thing on BBC, which has like 4 or 5 alternate ending. Sorry, spoiler, has like 4 or 5 alternate endings, and it's just brilliant. At first you're kind of like, oh god, this isn't quite working, but then like the last of the endings pulls all the others together. Anyway, it's a work of absolute genius, and I just thought, well, yeah, do you know what, I'm quite happy with that. And but I was also kind of like, well, people are going to think I've seen I May Destroy You and I'm just stealing ideas from black women, so that'll be the end of my career. But I saw it, I wrote the book first, but what are you going to do?
I thought it suited Cliff actually to have have these two different scenarios laid out. I thought actually kind of fitted with the way we've seen Cliff's life panning out through the short glimpse of it we've had in the book. And actually, the comment from Carly there, she's happy with your ending anyway. You've got the tick of approval.
And Clue, of course, yeah.
Clue, yes.
Yeah. Clue, I love. I mean,
example.
that's one of my favorite terrible, brilliant movies. And I suppose, like, because I mean, that's weird that because we haven't talked about Clue before, Carly and I, but it's weird because I did love that film when I was a kid, and that's one of those like slightly trashy. There's no weird films, that and films like Transylvania 65000 and all those like weird like Mel Brooks-ish type films. Although I don't think he's involved in either of those. But yeah, like Clue, I just really liked the idea that well, it's based on a board game, so that you can have obviously several different endings, and I think you're right. It was something to do with it felt. Once I put it in there, it felt like it worked. Sometimes you can't always identify why it does either, but I think something to do with Cliff's character and his journey as a character, I think, yeah.
I think we've handled talking about the end of the book without giving anything away quite well there.
I hope so. I can't really remember what happens. I haven't read it in a year, so I can't really remember. I'm glad you didn't ask. What happens at the end?
Well, there's time. You've mentioned a little bit about some of the characters and things being in kind of a product of the time in which you've been writing this. So I think this is a natural place to pick up on Kieran's question of whether lockdown has planted any seeds for your next book. Have you drawn inspiration from these months locked away in your pajamas, scribbling?
Well, I mean, thank you, Kieran. It's a very good question. But also, like, these are my but the Angels of Cairo and How Love Actually Ruined Christmas were my lockdown books. I wrote them both last year during lockdown, and I don't know. I mean, maybe there's another. I hope there's not another. I hope there's not enough time to write another lockdown book. I hope I've run out of time. As far as like seeds of ideas for next book, I mean, I'm doing a PhD at the moment, so there's an ongoing sort of big piece of work going on there, and I'm also sort of toying around with the idea of maybe writing a book about Newport, where I'm from, a novel, which has been something that's sort of been thrown at me for 20 years. When you write a book about Newport, and I think maybe I've stumbled upon possibly stumbled upon the way to do it, and that's got a lot to do with like your progress as a writer from book to book or whatever you're working on. And I think there's something in the experience of Angels of Cairo has given me an idea for a voice for a book about Newport. So I'm writing around it. I'm writing it. Okay, I'll say I'm writing it. But whether it goes anywhere, I don't know. And it's kind of something at the moment where I'm sort of just chipping away at ideas. I'm writing some of it on my phone. I'm writing some of it on my laptop. I'm writing some of it in notebooks. So it may just be a complete unholy mess, which could be the best book ever written about Newport, the most accurate. But I mean, it may come to nothing. One day, undoubtedly, I'll write a novel about Newport. Whether it ever gets published, I don't know. But whether this is it, I don't know. We'll see.
We will see. I've got one eye on the time here as well. So I think you've got another reading. Should we use that maybe to wrap up? Because it'd be great to hear from the other reading I think you've got lined up.
Yeah, sure. This is a shorter one. And yeah, well, this essentially is gives a little bit of an idea of the sort of the mix and match of the prose of the book. So this is when we meet Howard Phillips, but also the woman he's with, Deb Dallow, who's a slightly mysterious international film producer. I'm not going to swear because just in case there's any it's difficult, isn't it? Because you don't know if somebody's listening and they've got like children in the background or something like that playing on an iPad or something. Cliff has come out of the White Room, revivified, feeling like some focus has come to him. And just as he strides back into the office, he sees two new figures standing by the potted plant, talking to Sammy. No way. What are they doing here? He feels the positivity drain out of him like he has a crack in his foot. Is there any way he could be mistaken? No, it's them. First, there's Deb Dallow, unmistakable, even in a room that pays tribute to her height and porcelain paleness. She's statuesque, propped up by a silver cane. That's new. Her elegant clothes, shapeless, a complex system of folded robes and silks and lace. She doesn't walk into a room, she unfurls into it. She has a voice straight out of Tennessee Williams, one that goes out of her like a log flume. She talks about her hometown of Biloxi as if it's simultaneously Mordor and Graceland. And she does it with a tilted head, her face leaning back as if her nose and lips were in danger of sliding off if she straightened up. Cliff has always recognised her charms, a thoughtful face, pointed features, high cheekbones, narrow eyes. And in the 10 years or so they've been crossing paths, she seems to have reached her correct age, that age when all the eccentricities, the myths and stories, the difficulties, when they've all come together to find a distinct coherence. Professionally, there is a seductive rationale to all this. She is a producer, although Cliff can't remember the last time he saw her name on a credit. Rumour has it she works much deeper behind the scenes nowadays, whatever that means. Every time he meets her, she's working for some different organisation that he has never heard of. Deb Dallow has taught Cliff many lessons over the years, most notably that people can be talked into anything. And if she has a philosophy, that is most likely it. Second is the man stood to Deb's left. Lean, expressionless, in a cheap olive suit that hangs off him like it's been draped over a tree stump while the owner goes skinny dipping. The dark-eyed figure of Howard Phillips. He is creepy. He lingers, loiters. Cliff had honestly thought Howard was dead. Had somebody told him that? He had memories of someone somewhere, sometime saying something like, Howard Phillips is dead. Or did somebody finally just tell him Howard was dead? But he looks very much medically alive in this office. The thing that makes him stand out in this instance is the thing that he has on his head, a garment that sits there like a pimple, one that speaks without subtlety of both smallness and loudness all at once. Howard Phillips is wearing a MAGA cap. It sits there, unsuited as any hat would be to this gormless head, a head propped on his knotty shoulders like a castle turret made of repurposed gravestones. The cap, pulsating red, as if something that should be operating inside his body is now exposed on the outside. Cliff has never before noticed quite what a glorious metaphor the MAGA cap actually is. The fact it is on the head of Howard Phillips is not quite the shock it should be. Howard is an American filmmaker and one who made some ripples with films in the mid-noughties when he was starting out. A film about a woman obsessed with masturbating who eventually destroys an entire town. Cliff can never remember what it's called, but it's called something like Marla, A Fistful of Dynamite. Howard also directed a film about angels called Ingrate, which earned him a walkout at Cannes, although some say it was just because it was the lunchtime showing and the flyer had printed the runtime as 90 minutes rather than the actual 490 minutes. He also made a film about a wheelchair-bound serial killer called The Devil Has Two Wheels. In the last decade, as Howard's financiers began to shrink away from movies that had no tract with the sensitivities of a growing liberal American sensibility, Howard began to make documentaries. It was these that won him awards. Armfuls of them, from organizations called things like the Association of Moving Pictures for Jesus and Red Carpet Bomb magazine. He won the New Republic Stars of the Future Award in 2015 for a 6-hour documentary called Truth or Dare, The Crushing of the American Left. Cliff still hasn't seen that one. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gary. I've just noticed in the comments there's a little bit of support there for your Unholy Mess novel about Newport. So,
I'm looking for a title.
Here.
Thank you, Al. I'm looking for a title, an Unholy Mess. You'll be in
There's
it.
the inspiration. Right, I feel like this is probably the point where if we were in the Moringer or some other pub somewhere, I would be saying it's time for a drink. So I think what we might do is I'm going to say thank you very much for talking to me, and I think we're going to hand back over to Holly for a minute.
Thank you, Emma.
Hello. Yes, that was great. Thanks for that really insightful conversation between you two, and for your readings of the book, Gary, as well. That was great. And also to everyone who wrote in the chat, there were some great comments and questions there.
Sorry, I know this is a terrible thing, but could I just acknowledge that Sharif has put a comment in, and it was Sharif who actually invited me to. He's the International Book Festival director in Cairo, who invited me there last year. So I just thought, I should definitely. He's a wonderful guy, Sharif, and I just thought we should definitely acknowledge that he's turned up. I believe on the first day of this year's book fair, as well. So. He's popped his head in what is probably an insanely busy time. So I just thought I'd flag that up.
Yeah, thanks, Sharif. So just before we go, I'll just do a bit of housekeeping. Just want to remind you again that if you want to buy Angels of Cairo, you can find it on the Bookish website. The link should be on screen now, and of course also in the description box below too. So if you haven't already, get your hands on this book via those links. And finally, from everyone at Parthian, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We hope you enjoyed it, and we wish you all a lovely rest of your evening.